Well, hey, Gundam fans, welcome to another episode of Gundam Explained. Today's episode is pretty interesting. I've been thinking about this a lot, but Jedi versus Newtype. I mean, really more specifically, it's Force user versus Newtype, or whatever the Force is in the Star Wars universe, and compare it to, I guess, the Newtypes and whatever that is from the Gundam universe. And if you haven't, please subscribe, and by the end of the video, if this seems cool, like it, that helps me out. But let's get started. So Star Wars. Star Wars is cool. I like Star Wars. I tend to bring it up a lot. And I like its storytelling, and it's comparable to Gundam. I've said this before, but I consider UC Gundam, Universal Century, to be like a more mature version of Star Wars. Now, the original Gundam came out in 1979, so that was after the 1977 Star Wars. And I've heard that there's been inspiration taken from Star Wars when developing Gundam, even though a lot of elements in Gundam were already elements of Japanese culture. In fact, a lot of what's in Star Wars is based on Japanese culture. But one of the interesting aspects of it is that fantasy element that both Star Wars and Gundam have, whereas everything's kind of like sci-fi, we have this fantasy magical element that's pretty interesting. And like I said, I consider Gundam to be a little more of a mature Star Wars, and I think that even makes sense around that fantasy aspect of Newtype and Jedi. So yeah, let's get into that. In Star Wars, we have a Jedi. It's really just a Force user. The Force is something that flows through everyone, around everything. It just exists. It's there. And some creatures in the galaxy are more in tune with the Force and to leverage it, to use it to physically lift objects like telepathy, various other things too, just faster in combat, a lot of physical capabilities that look very fantastical. And it's really just a new hope that really establishes it, and we don't see a lot. It's kind of like that trickery with the mind you see with the Obi-Wan. Apparently, the use of a lightsaber is it's easier for a Force user, and along with that, there could be a Jedi and there could be a Sith. And when we get into Jedi and Sith, we're now saying where the Force has been taken over time and kind of the Force has been taken and sort of categorized, where you have people going around this kind of mystical thing, adding labels to it, adding rites, rituals, religious aspects to it. I guess when it comes to the Force, the creatures or the living beings in that galaxy have had a longer time to learn about it and to adapt it. Now, when it comes to Newtypes, what's interesting about UC Gundam, or the first Mobile Suit Gundam, is that is a newer phenomenon. Now, there's some that understand it a whole lot, like Char Aznable or the scientists on either the Federation or Xeon side. But for the general public, it's more of like, oh, is this really a thing? Are these people Newtypes? And it's only because it's people that happen to just do very well in combat scenarios, when that's controlling one of the mobile suits, the crew of White Base. And sometimes it's not really specifically said if someone is a new type or not. Sometimes it's just assumed they are. Or sometimes it's obvious if they're doing some of that telepathy communication. So in the Gundam universe, even though that the new type phenomenon is still young, the idea comes from the fact that humans are also living in space colonies. And I guess it's adapting to that of unlocked potential with the mind, and it's more focused around that. And yes, sometimes we'll come across characters that are born on Earth that are new types. That's well established, but in the UC stories, but I think it just has to do with the nature of humans going to space, coming back, maybe picking up some certain attributes from that as they are reproducing. And what's interesting in UC is they've gone as far as experimenting with this phenomenon. So if there's an old type or a person that doesn't have the new type ability, they have these science labs set up where they will experiment on people to figure out more about it, how to harness the power, create people into new types. And there's a lot of horror of that's within the Gundam UC timeline. And I would check out Thunderbolt for one. Unicorn narrative. They really do a good job of explaining that. And we see some cool stories in Zeta and Double Zeta as well, but it gets a lot deeper in those other movies I mentioned. And what's interesting is it gets to a point, especially around like Hathaway and future Gundam, where the new type phenomenon isn't really believed anymore. It seemed like it was a part of the war effort, is really focused around that. And I guess it was almost like it was kept a secret, so people didn't know they had these new type abilities. And a lot of times it would be people that are new types are very attracted to each other, and that could have to do with the way the consciousness works, because a new type would feel a pressure sometimes, or just something they could feel but you can't describe in a physical way that something is occurring. And so in the Star Wars universe, something almost similar with that happened, although with the newer movies, sometimes it's hard to really explain, because they had, after, the prequels, the Emperor wanted to eradicate the Jedi, but that seemed to be the Force at large, because as we got to A New Hope, it seemed like all that stuff was mythical, that had to do with the Force or Force users or Jedis. But when we see something like Rogue One, we see there's still sects that are, I guess, have that religious sort of vibe to wanting to believe in the Force. And I find that very interesting. So it could just be the point of view we saw on Tatooine from A New Hope, but I guess it also came from the higher up in the Empire, which maybe that was done by the Emperor to make sure no one really knew of the Jedi or Force users. I don't know. It's a little gray there. And I got to say, with the UC Gundam, they've really done a good job with that aspect of a new type. It's really scoped to military use. And any time that it seems like, really, because it's about Gundam's mobile suits. So a lot of what occurs, conflict, is framed around use of mobile suits. And again, a lot of new types are just could use a mobile suit, unlike others. Like, let's say the controls of a mobile suit are very hard to control, very sensitive. New types can adapt. Yeah, as we get into F91 and Victory, that new type stuff isn't really talked about much anymore. And I don't know if that was a choice by the production studio of like, hey, people don't like this that much, or I don't know, because it seems like there's eras of UC where the new type stuff is talked about, or it's not talked about. I don't know, like 8th MS team, not talked about too much, even though there's instances where they used the new type consciousness sound between two characters when they were talking to each other. So to get back to some of the fantastical elements when it comes to new types in Gundam UC, one aspect that is on par with Star Wars happens to be maybe talking with ghosts, deceased people. A lot of times a new type, or maybe even non-new types, would hear from someone that may have recently been deceased or is dead, or through some sort of unconscious state, like we saw with Camille and Double Zeta, and can speak to others and maybe motivate them to do certain actions. And then we even get to where we see that the new type wave, it's actually a physical wave that you can see, and we see that in Char's counterattack around the asteroid when Amuro is trying to push it, and then everyone wants to join in and help it push the asteroid, and it seems like the wave got bigger. That probably had to do with, trying to visually represent what it looked like to use the new type ability in that way. Whereas in Star Wars, a lot of times there isn't any sort of visual cues used to show like, oh, someone's using, a force push or grab, and then you kind of see like some special effect to show that. Something that's also interesting that I want to bring up is in A New Hope, you see Luke in his X-Wing, the targeting computer comes up to his face, although Obi-Wan is telling him through the Force, as a deceased individual, just to use the Force. And then it's cool because we see Amuro when he's in his RX-78-2 in the first Mobile Suit Gundam, and he also has that targeting computer kind of show up in front of his face. It's kind of a cool nod between the two. But we also see Luke is using an X-Wing. It's kind of like the premier military weapon that the Rebel Alliance is using, and Amuro's in his RX-78-2. Again, kind of that premier weapon. And they both have similar colors, kind of that white and red. Even though we see a little bit more colors with the RX-78-2, but there's parallels there when it comes to that, and that could have been intentional or not, but it's very cool. And before I move on with further comparison about like Amuro or a Jedi or Sith versus new types, there is this other element that has to do with the Force and has to do with new types. A lot of it is about our consciousness. There's things that are spoken about like in Buddhism, and maybe other religions that focus on the mind, about consciousness, like the origins of consciousness, and what that all means to life. I find that stuff very interesting. There's this spirituality there that I think it kind of makes sense, even though it's a fantasy element. Both of these, I guess, it's because the Star Wars has the advanced technology in a way, they're almost like future. So, how much more of our consciousness are we going to be able to understand going into the future and finding out there's telepathy abilities? There's ways we can understand people better using our consciousness, where in certain situations you can't really describe things like feelings. Like we attach um, labels to feelings and things. And when it comes to the Force users, especially the Jedi Order, they try to remove from attachment. There's that whole idea about not labeling things, judgment. That's something that's also called out in some ancient religions and Buddhism. But the new type phenomenon is so early still, and they don't really want to teach many people about it really, and they just want to keep it militarized, that's not explored as much. And I think that's fine. I think it's cool to kind of keep it mystical, but it's grounded enough in some of these teachings that from early in time, like Buddhism, that just make it interesting. So let's talk about the new type verse like a Jedi. So you got Luke with a lightsaber. What does Amuro have? He doesn't really have much unless he was in his Gundam that has a lightsaber, but then Luke could be in his X-Wing. And, it's very interesting. I brought this up before where Luke blows up the Death Star that I think had millions of people in it, and they're all cheering at the end, and Amuro is sent out to battle. And again, this is Luke going into battle for the first time. Amuro's sent out to battle for the first time in his mobile suit, kills a couple mobile suits, and he's in shock that he killed people. Again, it's that more mature aspect that I'm talking about. If we were to say Luke Skywalker and Amuro were in a fight and they didn't have any weapons on them, who would win? First off, you would think because of all the teachings in the history, it would be Luke Skywalker. If you wanted to tune into the dark side of the Force, he could just force choke Amuro. He could probably force jump over him. Amuro might be able to be quick in fighting, being able to kind of get a sense of what type of moves Luke would use toward him. But I really think the history and the teachings of using the Force kind of gives Force users the upper hand when it comes to the current state of new types in Mobile Suit Gundam. But again, if they were in their own sort of weapons, I think a mobile suit would go up against any type of vehicle in the Star Wars universe. A big part of that is you will see them use their like the X-Wing and TIE Fighter, and maybe a Force user is better at it. But in the Gundam universe, a mobile suit might have a Psychomu system. It's a system that actually kind of reads the psycho waves, the consciousness of a new type individual, and that can kind of enhance the ability of the mobile suit. Sometimes that goes a little too far, and it could even kill the pilot. But even without that, a new type does a little better with their ability of controlling these mobile suits, because they have to be able to make quick adjustments, turn around. They have all these limbs they're using, which there's more you have to control than like an X-Wing. So if we had the X-Wing versus the mobile suits, that's where I would think that the Gundam universe has the upper hand. If it was a new type in a mobile suit versus a Jedi in one of their ships. So what would be really cool? In Star Wars, they're really, really focusing a lot on the Jedi or the Force aspect, which can be good in a certain way. I think the original trilogy handled it well, but that seems to be more of the focus rather than what the original trilogy was establishing in the world, and that really is these factions that are fighting against each other and people that are caught up into it. I feel like the later Star Wars are willing to throw away the world in order to make cool things happen with characters that really just happen to be related to the Force. Now, with Mobile Suit Gundam, they've done a really good job of being very consistent. Again, they started very soon, Star Wars 77, Gundam 79. Gundam has had so many things come out since then, even up until today, and they have been very consistent with that aspect. Because like I said, in Gundam, they are really focusing on the military aspect. They're not making the new type phenomenon really well known, so they're able to harness it in that way. And even with the history of the Star Wars universe. Um, as they've gotten later into the Star Wars stories, it's really, less about the world and more scoped down to the characters and their settings, like the Book of Boba Fett, for instance, that newest one, even the Mandalorian. I think it's more about the characters, like, oh, the Mandalorian and Baby Yoda meeting Luke. While that's very cool, it didn't really establish what the overall world is like, especially post Return of the Jedi. I really want to understand that. But when you get into Gundam, they really establish the world. And you're even wondering who's the bad guys and who's the good guys, because it depends on what tactic any side is using at any time to get the upper hand or make sure money is still flowing with mobile suit development. So what would be really cool, and again, I haven't watched Turn A, so it could be that this is something and I'm totally missing it, but it'd be very cool if there was some future Gundam where we see that it has been established what a new type is, how to determine if you are a new type, and there's training. There's like years and decades, centuries of research to really can hone in your new type abilities. Maybe they can go to the point where they're doing a new type force push, new type force jump, maybe even a smaller beam saber. It would be just like a Jedi. I know there's no reason to do that, but I think that kind of be an interesting thing that they look at into the future. And even an idea that is, I think, related almost to our Earth's history. For instance, Buddhism was rediscovered. It was rediscovered from when, who knows, it was a lost teaching that was rediscovered. It's very powerful what is involved in a lot of the meditation that can be applied to anything. And you wonder, are we from some sort of lost civilization? We are a culture of amnesia, a civilization that's like post-apocalyptic, and we're just learning about things that we do with our mind, but we lost a lot of it. Or maybe people in power and control are trying to hide what our capabilities are so they can have that control. So that would be an interesting aspect of a future Gundam, even though they're kind of doing that right now with controlling the new type narrative. What if we get a future where it's like a post new type world, and we're seeing where they lost a lot of that, they're kind of gaining that back. We see completely different looking types of mobile suits in the future. I don't know, I'm just spitballing here, but I think it's very interesting, the intersection of, the Star Wars use of the Force, Gundam use of the new type, and kind of a current humanity on Earth here on present day with the ancient spiritual teachings and things like that. So anyway, I thought that was a cool, fun discussion. I've been wanting to talk about this forever. I'm going to keep doing a series of Star Wars versus Gundam videos, because I think there's a lot of cool stuff to talk about, and it kind of helps you dive more deeper into the lore to understand it when you can compare it to something else. So if you like this, please give it a like, and I would love to see some comments, what everyone thinks about it. When I do my podcast, I would love to read some of the comments of what you guys have come across with this subject. So anyway, thanks for watching, and we'll talk later. See you.